Hello and welcome to this new video in the long-term reading project on James Joyce's novel Ulysses. If you're just joining this channel for the first time, if this is the first video you're watching, um, about every 3 weeks or so I publish a video on one of the 18 episodes of the novel Ulysses. And we're now at the 4th episode, so I recommend starting by watching the videos of the previous episodes first, and ideally even watching the 4 preparatory videos on other works of world literature that are helpful in order to better understand Ulysses. And you can find everything compiled in this playlist. Okay, so today we are looking at the 4th episode of Ulysses. This episode is often referred to as the Calypso episode because this had been the title in one of the early versions of the Ulysses. Okay, what's this video about? How is it structured? There will be 4 chapters of this video, and each of these chapters you can select independently by using the timestamps below. So first I will quickly summarize the plot. So what is happening here in this episode? Then I will talk a little bit more in detail about how I see Leopold Bloom as a counterpoint, a counterweight to Stephen Dedalus. And then I will talk a little bit about the parallels to the Odyssey. And in the 4th and final chapter of my video, I will talk a little bit about the narrative means and devices that Joyce is using in this episode. Okay, on the first point, the plot. The first 3 episodes became increasingly challenging, I think, with the 3rd episode being the climax, in which we found ourselves exclusively within Stephen Dedalus's mind, thanks to this stream of consciousness narrative technique with all its leaps of thought and associations and memories and fragments of sentences, etc., etc., just like a life ticker directly out of Stephen's brain. And in contrast, this 4th episode it's just a piece of cake, at least at first glance. Joyce uses a rather, or seems to use a rather conventional narrative situation and technique. And we'll take a closer look at that to see if it's really that conventional and simple. But at least I think after these 3 episodes, it's in this one, it's quite easy to understand what is happening here on the plot level. So we are still on the same day, June 16th, 1904, but now we jump back in time again. It's 8 o'clock in the morning again, and we finally meet one of the most important, or even the most important character of the novel, Leopold Bloom himself. So Leopold, he prepares breakfast for his wife Marion, who is better known as Molly, and who is still in bed or even asleep. And Leopold prepares a breakfast. He also gives the cat some milk, and then he leaves the house to go to the butcher's to buy one of his personal favorite ingredients for his own breakfast, a kidney. And on his way to the butcher's, he greets neighbors and shopkeepers in the area. He engages in little thought experiments, little games about calculations, how a pub owner in Dublin could survive economically, what profit margin he needs for each pint sold, and these things like that. And at the butcher's, he eyes an attractive young woman for a moment, and when he gets home, he continues preparing the breakfast. He brings his wife the mail that has arrived in the meantime, and he almost burns his fried kidney in the pan. And then he reads a postcard from their daughter Millie, who is only 15 or has just turned 15, but who has already moved out of home to train as a photographer. Leopold Bloom, we learn that he's already wearing his good black suit because he plans to attend the funeral of an acquaintance at, I think, at 11 a.m. And then, after reading the postcard, he retreats to the bathroom, taking a newspaper with him. And yeah, he is relieved to find that the constipation of the previous day has obviously disappeared. Okay, so not that much. Second point, let's talk a little bit about how I see Leopold Bloom as a counterpoint or antithesis of Stephen Dedalus. So as I mentioned, overall, this is not a particularly spectacular beginning. At a first glance, you might think it's just a fairly uneventful morning routine of an average Dubliner in 1904. But I find it fascinating that even after these few pages, Leopold Bloom strikes me as a rather familiar and above all a very likable person. The text, despite its shortness, it contains a wealth of details that reveal a great deal about Leopold Bloom's his thoughts, his feelings, his character, his worries, and his desires. And my impression is that this character is very cleverly designed by James Joyce as a counterpoint to Stephen Dedalus. He's not completely different. For me, what is very special about the characterization of Leopold Bloom is this very subtle balance between similarity and dissimilarity to Stephen Dedalus. He's a character who shares many themes and challenges and also biographical details with Stephen Dedalus. So there is a clear connection, a linking element between Leopold Bloom and Stephen in almost all aspects of their lives as far as we know them right now. But the thing is that Leopold fills in all these points in a very different way. Now, to be fair, I think we can deduce that from various details in the novel that Bloom is almost twice as old as Stephen, so it's natural that he has a different approach to things. He is naturally a much more mature character with more life experience, and this should reflect somehow in the way that he looks at things and life in general. Okay, let's go through some of these points that I see as linking points and linking elements where also there's a different approach taken by Stephen and Leopold. Let's go through some of them one after the other. First, I think what is very obvious is that for Leopold, there's more, in Leopold, there's more empathy instead of distance to other people. At the end of the third episode, Stephen is not only outwardly quite unattached to anything, I think it becomes clear that he is largely broken away from his family. He is also estranged from Buck Mulligan and this third person in the tower, Mr. Haynes. And he is estranged also from his former friends he was friends with before his exile in Paris. So he's a lonely wanderer through the world. But he's also quite distant from other people at an emotional level. His thoughts revolve either around very abstract theoretical problems or around himself or around his separation from others or from his being different than others. So Stephen shows no signs of a genuine interest in others, no real compassion, no interest in or no need for closeness and close relationships, or I didn't see any clear signs of empathy in Stephen. So and Leopold Bloom in this aspect seems to be quite different. He also he is similar to Stephen in that way that he also seems to maintain his independence of thought and thinking and doing his own thing. But still, he is someone who cares about his fellow human beings and his fellow creatures. He worries about them, he empathizes with them, and he actually does something for them when it is necessary or meaningful. And although Leopold's and Molly's marriage is anything but smooth sailing, as we will learn in the course of the novel, still he makes her breakfast and he brings it to her bed. And this may not seem very unusual to today's readers, but in the 1920s, it was completely outside the norm, almost a scandalous reversal of conventional roles. So I think it was very unusual for a husband to do this. And he also takes care of the cat. He gives her milk. He gives her the wrapping paper from the kidney to lick. And also he seems to have a very jovial attitude towards his neighbors, acquaintances on the street. He greets them friendly. He feels sympathy for this deceased neighbor whose funeral he will have to attend later in the day. So, in other words, he is an empathetic, good-natured, perhaps sometimes even too good-natured person who runs the risk of being taken advantage of by others. Second point, religion. So very similar to Stephen, Leopold Bloom has also distanced himself from the religious traditions in which he grew up. He has he has distanced himself quite far from that, but more on that in a moment. And unlike Stephen, however, this does not seem to be uh, such a permanent inner struggle for him. Probably he is more settled in this aspect. With Stephen, one gets the feeling that he is continuously fighting and struggling internally. So just as Buck Mulligan constantly ridicules Christian rhetoric and symbolism in an external way with his flippant speeches, so Stephen has a constant internal struggle of constant confrontation and distancing himself from the Catholic faith. Some rage going on in him constantly. So with Leopold Bloom, it's quite different. Between the lines, we learn that there is a certain connection to the Jewish faith. There's the mention of scrolls of scripture, of kosher food, and lemons that play a role in a certain Jewish holiday. But these are not at all mentioned in a way that indicates any struggle, or there are no inflammatory words used. He does not agonize over this topic. As the novel progresses, we learn that Leopold's father was in fact Jewish, but was married to a non-Jewish woman. And that is also an interesting constellation, because according to the Orthodox Jewish doctrine and tradition, this means that actually Leopold Bloom is not Jewish. According to the Jewish tradition, only someone born to a Jewish mother is a full Jew by birth, and a Jewish father does not count. So someone who only has a Jewish father can, of course, convert to Judaism, but this person is not Jewish by birth. So this interesting so-called matrilineal definition of belonging to an ethno-religious group is an interesting aspect here, because also I think it may be surprising for some of us, and it contradicts this cliched notion of Judaism as a primarily patriarchal religion. So reality seems to be far more complex. But what becomes very clear in the text is that Leopold Bloom does not feel in any way connected to the Jewish religion, at least not in a way that he would be obliged to follow any of these traditions. I think for anyone with just a little knowledge about Judaism, this is more than obvious from just taking a quick look at his breakfast. Let me explain. A very characteristic aspect of Judaism is its very strict and detailed dietary laws. There are very strict rules about which foods are kosher, that is pure and considered pure in a ritualistic sense, and permitted, and which food is not kosher. And so there are far too many lists and rules here, but far too many rules to list them here. But here are the most important dietary laws that Leopold Bloom trespasses without making a fuss about it. So important thing is that most inner organs of animals are considered non-kosher. So mainly because they cannot be completely cleansed of blood, and blood is considered impure. So and kidneys and stomachs are considered particularly unclean or impure, non-kosher. But actually these ones are the inner organs that Leopold Bloom particularly likes to eat, as we learn in one of the very first sentences of the episode. And then he doesn't go to the Jewish shochet, so that the person who slaughters animals according to the Jewish rules and traditions, but he goes to a Christian butcher, and he doesn't just buy and eat any kidney, but a pig's kidney. So, and in Judaism, a pig is considered an extremely unclean animal. Nothing from a pig may be eaten, and then he fries the kidney in butter. And this again another trespassing, because meat and dairy products must be strictly separated in Jewish in the Jewish kitchen. They may not be prepared together, must not be consumed together. So without Joyce writing it explicitly, the description of this breakfast, the pig's kidney fried in butter, it alone, this makes it very crystal clear that Leopold Bloom has lost or consciously abandoned any kind of ritual religious connection to the Jewish faith. But for him, this does not come across as a bitter struggle at all, struggle for self-assertion and separation, not at all. He simply does it because it fits in with his cheerful and pleasure-loving nature. He ate with relish the inner organs of beasts and fowls. He just did it. Okay, so far I've pointed out two character traits, his empathy and his carefree approach to religious rules. And as a connection between these 2 points of empathy and religion, here's a little thought experiment that further, I think, clarifies the difference between Leopold and Stephen. And admittedly, this is pure speculation from my side and not supported at all by the text. But if I imagine Leopold Bloom in a situation similar to Stephen's, with his dying mother asking him to pray, because this would make dying easier for her, I'm quite sure that Leopold Bloom would not have made any fuss about it. He would have even recited a surah from the Quran or a Buddhist mantra, whatever his mother requested. He would have done that, regardless of his personal beliefs or lack thereof. If his dying mother had asked him to do so in order to ease her passing away, he would have prayed whatever prayer she'd asked for. So at least that's how I imagine this Leopold Bloom after reading this episode. So that would be my first impression on his character. So quite different from the way how Stephen would behave or has behaved in this situation. Okay, let's move on to the third point, family. I think there's both have something in common. They both have had traumatic family experiences in some way due to the death of close relatives. So Stephen is a half-orphaned son because his mother has died, and Leopold is, you could say, it's a half-orphaned father because his second child with Molly, his son Rudy, died shortly after birth. And neither of them has come to terms with this loss. And in both cases, the loss is also linked to the theme of guilt and betrayal. So Stephen feels guilty towards his mother, as if he had betrayed her by not giving her the support she deserved, by refusing to pray. And Leopold Bloom, on the other hand, he is the one who was betrayed as a result of his son's death. We can only guess it in this episode, but later we will see this confirmed, that since the death of their son, Leopold's and Molly's marriage has been more or less broken. She now seeks elsewhere with other men the physical intimacy that she needs. So she will learn that she is currently cheating on Leopold with her manager Blaise Boylan, and Leopold knows it. He suspects it or knows this, because I think this is why he casts such a suspicious glance at the letter from Boylan that Molly half-heartedly hides under her pillow. And this is also why he spends the whole day wandering around Dublin instead of going home, because he doesn't feel like it, right? He is too cowardly to catch Molly and Blaise Boylan in the act. So neither of them has a cheerful family idyll to offer, but in very different ways. So Stephen has chosen to be almost completely unattached to his family, while Leopold is trapped in family ties that make him unhappy. Let's move on to the fourth point, intellectual curiosity. Like Stephen, Leopold is also a person with a high level of intellectual curiosity. He probably did not enjoy as much formal academic training as Stephen did, but he's not a dimwit who walks through the world blindly and thoughtlessly. He loves speculative little thought experiments. For example, he questions popular sayings and old wives' tales about the behavior of cats. He makes rough calculations and estimates about how profitable it might be to run a pub in Dublin, or how complicated it or even impossible it must be to get from A to B within Dublin without passing a pub. And he plays with this idea of what would happen if you followed the rising sun fast enough, whether you would age at all, because that day would never end, you would never see a sunset. And in contrast to Stephen, however, it is noticeable that Leopold Bloom never gets bogged down in these thoughts, but he rather handles them very playfully. He leaves some things or most things half thought through, and he does not get carried away also with grandiose abstract theories like Stephen does with his thoughts on Aristotle and realism and idealism and so on. Leopold Bloom is more down to earth in all his thought experiments. He's concerned with the practical implications, in particular the economic ones. And the place that philosophy occupies in Stephen's world of ideas, I think this place is taken by economics in Leopold Bloom's world of ideas. He's constantly calculating how much things cost, or how much they should cost, what would be an appropriate profit margin, how you could sell them, what profit or loss certain economic actions would yield. Fifth point, sense and sensibility. Stephen and Leopold, they are both concerned with the senses. In Stephen's case, it's especially in the third episode, but also in other ones, it's primarily about theoretically motivated experiments with the senses. If you remember in this third episode, he repeatedly opens and closes his eyes to test the ineluctable modality of the visible. And Leopold Bloom has a different approach. He simply enjoys his senses, or what joy the senses can give him. He likes to eat heartily. He likes strong flavors. He doesn't care if any theologians or rabbis would prescribe something else for him. He is, I think, a rather sensual guy in general. I think it was certainly strange or even scandalous for the readers of the time that even going to the toilet is described here in detail. The pleasure of holding it a little longer and then being able to enjoy the relief and the rising warmth even more consciously. One could call this vulgar, and I think many contemporary readers of Joyce's time have called this vulgar, but one could also appreciate it as an honest realism and see it as an accurate description of Leopold's attitude of welcoming all, literally all sensory perceptions. In keeping with his sensual nature, he also likes to look at pretty young women, for example, this other customer at the butcher's, but he does not do so in a sleazy, leering, or intrusive way, but rather like a connoisseur who perceives and appreciates beauty, but who, like a gentleman, can abide by the basic rule: just look, don't touch. Okay, sixth point, language skills. For both Stephen and Leopold, language is the primary tool of their profession or vocation. And so Leopold has to write texts for advertisements, so he is very much on the pragmatic, practical side of the things. Of course, this also requires a great deal of linguistic competence, of aesthetic sensibility, creativity, ingenuity, but not as a purely self-centered means of, like Stephen with his artist's attitude of perfecting one's own expression for the sake of itself, as a means in itself, but rather to put it at the service of another person or another a cause outside of oneself. And I don't want to judge this at all. I think it's a nice example of the clever way Joyce has created these two characters in a way so that they have many elements and character traits in common, many elements that connect them at their core, but which they fill in very in different ways, depending on the nature of their personalities. So there are certainly other points of contact between the two that might be used to illustrate this tension between what connects and what separates Leopold and Stephen. And please feel free to write in the comments your own observations if you have found any other additional examples. I would now like to move on to the third point of my video. So this is the parallel with the Odyssey. So what role does this parallel play here? So in the Calypso episode of the Odyssey, Odysseus or Ulysses is rescued by the nymph Calypso after a shipwreck, and he is held captive on her by her on her almost paradisiacal island, and probably her erotic seduction skills contributed also to the long duration of his stay there. And so she has fallen in love with the hero Ulysses, and she does not let him leave for, I think, for 7 years. In order to bind him to her permanently, she even offered or promised him immortality, but Odysseus didn't accept that. He longs for his wife Penelope, and he does not allow himself to be held captive permanently. However, he doesn't manage to get free by himself. He's only freed from Calypso by Calypso after the other gods gave her a hint that now it would be the proper time to let Ulysses go. Okay, we don't have a particularly large cast in this episode, so you don't have to be a Nobel Prize laureate to figure out who is who. So I think it's easy to see that Leopold Bloom has the role of Ulysses here, and Molly being the Calypso. And of course, Joyce does not depict this constellation of characters one to one, but rather in an ironically modified way, as he often does. So it is not a paradise island where our hero is held captive by a nymph. It is more like the gilded cage of a family home that appears perfect, maybe perfect on the outside, but it's a family home in which Leopold Bloom, by the standards of his time, seems to be more a henpecked husband, a man who brings his wife breakfast in bed, and he doesn't dare to go home when she receives her lover in the afternoon. And instead of a nymph, it's perhaps a woman with nymphomaniac tendencies who brings her lovers home to the marital bed. So the situation is twisted in an ironical way. So perhaps I see this as a little too simplistic and banal, but these are, I think, somewhat the parallels I see here with a specific Joycean humor. One could also examine this text for the motive of immortality, which I have not done in detail here. After all, there should be something for everyone to discover for themselves, which we can then discuss in the comments. And one could see points of reference to this immortality and death motive in, for example, in the thought experiment that Leopold conducts. So what would happen if one always followed the rising sun and thus never sees a sunset and never grew a day older? Or one could see the whole morning also as being overshadowed by death, because this upcoming funeral of Bloom's acquaintance or neighbor Dignam, it dictates Bloom's whole schedule for the day, and even his clothing. And yeah, please let me know if you found other reference to the death or immortality theme in the text. Okay, let's move on to the fourth point of my video, the final one, about the narrative means and devices. First, I would like to start with a small detail as an example how carefully the text is composed. For me, the contrast between Stephen Dedalus and Leopold Bloom is evident in many small details in the text. And one that I think is also very striking is the phonetic contrast. And Stephen Dedalus, both his own name and the names of the people around him, the people who play a role in his thoughts and in his environment, they are all characterized by rather hard sounds. Stephen Dedalus, Buck, Cranley, Kevin Egan, Deasy. So these are predominantly hard D, G, K sounds, and which also continues with the places Martello Tower, Dalkey, Sandicave. So Leopold Bloom, on the other hand, he's surrounded by soft, feminine, motherly sounding M and L sounds. So his wife Molly, his daughter Millie, who works in the town of Mullingar. So I think the sounds alone suggest that Stephen is surrounded by a certain sharpness and brusqueness, or he surrounds himself with it, while Leopold Bloom's world is characterized more by soft, warm, gentle sounds. So this soft and warm element is also something that constantly goes through his mind. He thinks several times very longingly of the warmth and the softness of his wife who is still lying in bed. A few more words on the narrative perspective and the narrative voice here. As I said in the beginning, everything seems very simple, uncomplicated, very accessible, especially in contrast to the previous episode. But if you take a closer look at how the story is told here, you quickly see that it is much more skillfully woven than it might appear at first glance. We have, I think, if you look at it in detail, we have a very innovative mixture of very different narrative techniques here. We have sections of a narrative situation predominantly from a personal perspective, with free indirect speech. So Leopold's thoughts preoccupied him as he moved gently through the kitchen, and then sometimes this shifts briefly into this stream of consciousness. So another slide of bread and butter, 3, 4, right. Or sometimes the narrator also takes a step back and describes things in a seemingly objective manner, like an external narrator. The cat mewed in answer and stalked stiffly around a leg of the table, meowing. But in the very next sentence, we turn to direct speech, just as she stalks over my writing table. So we here are from the perspective, from Leopold's perspective again. Sometimes there are also dialogue elements inserted in an almost cinematic manner without any narrator's commentary. So it's a very varied and quickly changing fabric of different closely interwoven narrative techniques and perspectives, but you don't notice this. But once you go through you've got through the first 3 episodes, this style does no longer seem confusing or alienating to the reader. Instead, at least in my impression, they are understood almost automatically and seem quite organic overall. So you just don't notice how the subtle structures. So after only 3 episodes, Joyce has already managed to educate his readership. I think that's quite an achievement in itself. So that brings us to the end of today's video. This video is a little bit shorter than the previous ones, not because I didn't feel like it, but I think it was simply a much more accessible episode, and it didn't contain as many heavyweight themes that could have triggered some of my lengthy, nerdy digressions. In the next video, we will take a look at the 5th episode, the Lotophags. This is an episode in which we will accompany Leopold Bloom to the post office. He will attend a church service in a Christian church. He will visit a pharmacy, and he will go to the bathhouse, among other places. And of course, we will also be talking about drugs, mind-altering substances. But until then, I hope you will have a great reading time. Take care, bye-bye, and ciao.